Hello, everyone. I'd like to introduce myself, Ernesto Pellegrino, CTO at Assurance IT. I'm joined along today with Tyler Greenfield, who's our subject matter expert in identity and deception from SentinelOne. Hey, Tyler, how you doing?
I'm doing great. It's good to be here with you chatting about identity and deception. I'm always a fan of that. So
It's definitely a hot topic today. We were all about protecting the endpoint, and now we're shifting about, maturing that process and using identity and how we protect identity. So look forward to getting into the conversation and really diving in a little deeper.
good.
So
Let's get rolling then. So
let's get
do you
rolling.
want to set the stage for me, and then we can dive into it, and I can go through kind of how SentinelOne's handling it. But it seems like we've got it going already.
For sure, for sure. When we think about protecting, and creating a zero trust environment, we talk about endpoints, cloud, and identity. And today, the focus is going to be all around Singularity XDR and how it integrates identity into that story. So we'll go ahead and we'll dive in, and we'll definitely focus in on identity today. So,
Perfect. And I think it's good to highlight that, just like we're going to kind of walk through how identity is a holistic approach, that SentinelOne really is taking a holistic approach to the in-network and endpoint-centric attacks, right? SentinelOne started out as an endpoint company, but the reality is those attacks have things that happen both before and after that involve other areas of your environment. And really being comprehensive around it is the best way to tackle these problems, right? So we'll start off kind of going through this anatomy of an identity-based attack, what that looks like and why it's so critical to be concerned about these portions. Then we'll kind of talk about what that landscape in terms of the legacy solutions that a lot of people who are viewing this are probably familiar with or have run into, as well as what it is specifically we mean when we talk about identity security from, a kind of EDR threat perspective that SentinelOne is focusing on. And then kind of break down what a solution that covers that realm should look like and should be really kind of focusing on, and then how the SentinelOne product really addresses those concerns. So if you want to go ahead, we could start with that kind of walkthrough of an anatomy of an identity-based attack.
definitely, we'll go on and continue moving along.
So, this is not anything that's going to be unfamiliar to most people, this first set of phases here, right? And we can kind of pause here. So what we've got with any attack in an environment, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking about commodity ransomware attacks, some of these more APT style ones that we've seen against city and state governments, or even against infrastructure providers like SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline. It starts out with some form of initial access, right? The attacker's getting into the environment, they're phishing, they're using some kind of methodology to get inside and get access to those initial assets. What often happens from there, and this happens in red team engagements, this happens in real attacks, or again, kind of regardless of what the end result is there will be reconnaissance that's done. And a lot of times nowadays, the primary reconnaissance is identity based, right? Because just scanning networks is something that we've all kind of picked up on, and we've got tools in place to detect, prevent, and mitigate. But going after those credentials, right? Because any system you land on in an environment is going to have some credentials on it, right? That system's part of a corporate environment. It needs access to some resources, whether it's something as simple as RDP keys that are on there or Windows credentials on some finance laptop, right? So attackers are first using those endpoints to understand the identity infrastructure and steal those local credentials, right? And even if there's not broad level domain credentials on that endpoint, say they compromise some IoT device, right? Well, if they're in line of sight of that identity infrastructure, those domain controllers that control that, they can start mapping out who the critical users are, what your password refresh policies are, where your critical systems are, right? And in fact, there's a lot of attacks that'll stop right here, right? Attackers who will go in and they'll do the reconnaissance, they'll dump some credentials, and they don't move further than that, right? They go and they sell that on the dark web.
Yeah.
They go and make their money off of that, right? And then other attackers can come in and do the nasty stuff. But the really interesting thing is at this stage, it's very hard for a lot of tools that are not specifically identity threat detection tools to detect this activity, because when you just ask information in the Active Directory environment, it responds because that's as designed. That's just how it works as an operational tool. And when those attackers resell that credential and attack path map of your identity infrastructure, how to find those critical users, the next person who comes in can go through the privilege escalation, lateral movement, and finally onto that impact stage super quickly. And what we see with the dwell time reports that we have coming out, right? Attackers are dwelling still dozens or hundreds of days in environments. The reason is because they're doing that first phase, the reconnaissance and credential harvesting. The reality, if you look at a lot of breach report breakdowns, is that once they have that, the privilege escalation, lateral movement, and then finally, if you can go to that final part, the nasty impact stuff happens very quickly, right? And so preventing and having an understanding of this reconnaissance credential, this early stage activity, shifting that far left, is really critical, especially with some of the more modern attacks we're seeing. And the way this kind of breaks down in the identity infrastructure land, if you want to go on, is we have kind of two sides to what we're doing, right? The traditional stuff that everyone's familiar with, which is kind of the IGA, IAM, just tools around authentication, federation, extension, management, right? We're really talking about cleaning up credentials as they move through the life cycle of an employee, making sure that those really highly privileged credentials are not handed out to the environment, you know, kind of without justification or authorization, and then adding additional layers in so that we can use this identity infrastructure in an internet and cloud connected world, right? SSO and MFA. But with the SentinelOne identity protection, we're really talking about this other side here. We're talking about identity attack surface management and the threat detection and response, right? We're talking about what happens when that attacker does get inside the environment in some capacity and starts trying to steal those credentials and map out where they go. Because, you know, anything in your multi-factor or your PAM or your IAM is not going to help and prevent that, right? So you need to, one, have an understanding of how is that core identity infrastructure, and for on-prem, we mean Active Directory, right? We also have our cloud stores like, you know, our GCP and AWS IAMs, and then our Azure Active Directories and all the flavors of that. But when you get access to that credential infrastructure, that all these solutions on the left-hand side, they kind of look to those infrastructures as the source of truth.
Right.
If I can start compromising those, then everything over on the left-hand side is now compromised, right? So this kind of breaks down into two major activities that you're going to be performing. Attack surface management, right? Understanding the state of that identity infrastructure, and for lack of a better term, how Swiss cheesy it is, right? Because the reality is, over the decades, right? I mean, and again, this is an operational and admin tool, right? AD admins, their job is to make sure everybody can log in and access the resources they need and do their jobs, right? And making sure that they've closed off all the different vulnerabilities and flaws that have been revealed over 20 some odd years of Active Directory being the primary identity provider is not necessarily their main concern or their area of expertise, right? So one, you need to understand that, because we can close down a lot of our attack surface by understanding that. And then you need to move on into detecting those reconnaissance and credential dumping attacks as they occur and trying to prevent and mitigate them. And really the way that you want to think about this when you're looking at a tool that's handling this right side of the you know, activities here, is it basically breaks down into three pillars, if you want to bring those up.
For sure.
You need to start with having visibility, right? Because we need to understand how that infrastructure is configured. And again, where are those holes that are left in the environment based on how we've built it out, right? And again, this is not to say that anybody's at fault when we find large amounts of holes, because the reality of this problem is that almost every environment out there fails 50% of the security validation checks that SentinelOne will do on this visibility side, right? And that just speaks to the ubiquity of this problem and how serious it is, right? Because once we have that visibility into that configuration, we can start reducing that attack surface, because we can go directly into AD and start removing all of those old settings or permission delegations that actually are vulnerable and taken advantage of by attackers on a pretty regular basis, right? So we put all that information with your, you know, in your hands, and then we move from there into the live attack detection and prevention. Because the reality is, you will not be able to completely reduce the attack surface just by removing those vulnerabilities and exposures in AD.
You can get better, Tyler, right? You can always enhance that security stance, but you won't be able to reduce everything. That's for sure.
Absolutely. And what I want to be clear is that you will probably be able to close off a good 50 or 70% of what you find. But some of those things in there are going to be things like, I have this business intelligence software that has a service account that has these specific permission requirements, right? And we might know as security professionals that those permission requirements, if somebody gains access to that service account, right,
some damage.
they could leverage that, right? So we might say, well, this is not a good way to build the requirements for your software. But if you go to that vendor, it might not be something they're going to fix right away. So that process, that vulnerability will
Right.
need to stay in place. And yes, we want and will help you and build scripts automatically to help you close off as much of it as possible. But the reality of identity infrastructure security is some of those holes are there because we have other things in our environment that have those requirements, right? And that's where we move into the attack detection and prevention, because we can start wrapping live prevention around someone trying to understand that. So again, that service account that has those permissions, an attacker comes in the environment, how do they even know it's there? They have to start querying the identity infrastructure to understand what accounts have these permissions, right? Who's been configured that way, right? And that's where SentinelOne in the attack detection and prevention side, we can actually provide capabilities to prevent the attacker from getting that information, understanding that kind of account with delegation even exists, and thus is an option for them to pull off an attack. And that's why these three pillars are important to have in a single product set addressing this problem, right? If you don't understand how your identity infrastructure is configured,
Sense.
you won't be able to identify those accounts that the attackers are going to look for at some point, right? And you won't know all the holes that you actually can close off by just going and reconfiguring your Active Directory, right? And then once you have that understanding and you do that work directly in AD, you can use that information, again, that discovery information, to build policies to prevent attackers from discovering and targeting those accounts that you can't directly remediate. And the way this breaks down in SentinelOne product suite, if you want to go on, is we start with Ranger AD, right? And what Ranger AD is that's our identity attack surface management tool. This is primarily done before an attack would take place, right? This is a tool that we're going to go into your environment. And again, it's incredibly easy to set up, very lightweight. We install a single agent on a single endpoint, and that will scan the entirety of the AD environment, right? Regardless of the scale. And we will take those results and we will give you reports of what is out of security exposure policy, right? What could be used by an attacker, what objects are impacted, and how to fix them. And in fact, for a lot of those, we will actually auto-generate remediation scripts for you if you want, so the admins can go and fix it at scale. From there, we'll move into the Ranger AD Protect, right? This is where we start installing an agent on the domain controllers that has ubiquitous visibility. So again, think about that IoT attack scenario, right? Somebody compromises that device, starts using it to try and understand how your infrastructure is set up so they can target it. From the Ranger AD Protect perspective, we will be able to detect and even mitigate a lot of those reconnaissance queries and prevent attackers from getting access to that information. And then the final stage, the Singularity Identity for endpoints. This is where we will actually be able to prevent attackers from dumping and stealing credentials, from cracking those accounts. If they try to understand subtle permissions, on those delegated service accounts or admin accounts in your environment, we will be able to actually actively lie to them, right, and steer them in a different direction. So not only are we preventing them from getting access to that, information about your identity infrastructure and stealing those credentials, we're actively poisoning the information they're trying to gather about your environment, right? So that they can't actually progress through that entire identity attack chain that we discussed at the beginning of this, right? Because it all starts with that initial access is terrible, it's bad, right? But we know that every once in a while, someone is going to click on that link that they shouldn't click on, right? They're going to install that USB drive that they shouldn't install. What happens next, right, is going to be that identity attack reconnaissance and credential dumping. And with this product suite we're talking about here for the Singularity Identity from SentinelOne, we're going to be able to prevent that entire chain from progressing past that initial infection, right? And any information that they think that they've harvested is going to be fake information that's not actually useful, right? So we're really dialing back the ability to control and protect against that kind of an engagement from when that nasty malware lands on a system all the way into the earlier phases that allow that to occur. And that's really what we're trying to do here with the Singularity Identity Suite from SentinelOne. So Ernesto, I really appreciate you having me on. Are there any other questions that you want to make sure that we get answered for anyone watching this?
Yeah, you know what? That's a good point. I have a couple of questions that come up, most of the time when it comes to Active Directory, right? So we have some customers or some customers that have Active Directory on site and are using Azure AD. Is this Singularity platform cover both silos?
So depending on your specific identity deployment, some of the modules are going to work in different ways, right? But yes, we do have coverage even for people who are in a kind of a pure state where we can move on and we can start protecting those cloud keys that are on endpoints, right? That are kind of the keys to the kingdom, right? you have to access that cloud environment somehow. There are people in your environment who have those cached, and that's where, if we look all the way to the right-hand side here, we've got the singularity identity for endpoints, right? Those endpoints that are used by your people to access cloud resources, we can protect those credentials, and we can understand, who might be trying to access this and prevent that access. So even in those environments, we're going to be able to provide pretty robust protection around the identities. And then a lot of environments we're seeing are hybridized in some capacity, right? Where they have some AD that might be used by the development group or might be used by internal teams.
Right.
And then the majority of people are going through O365 and Azure. Again, depending on your configuration and architecture, right? You might be deploying Ranger AD targeting just that on-prem or virtualized domain controller that the dev group's using, right?
Right.
You might be deploying the singularity identity endpoint broadly for everyone. But for people who only access O365 and Azure, it's focused on locking and guarding those credentials, right? Where for the developers who are actually dealing with a different environment, it's going to have more features to protect them and, the things that they're doing. So absolutely, we have ways of deploying this. It's just depending on what your exact configuration is, right? The mix of things that you're going to need and how you deploy it is going to change, but that's true of regular SentinelOne too, right? If you have a server heavy infrastructure, you're going to be deploying CWPP instead of the traditional endpoint agent in bulk, right? But yeah, that's a great question, because we do see more and more that people are going towards those kind of full cloud architectures.
Or hybrid, right? Yeah, they're definitely different routes to the way they're protecting, the way they're managing their Active Directory.
Yeah, the hybridized and the multi-cloud and having the links in between is incredibly common. And those are all attack points, right? So even if you say, even if you have, say, Azure AD and you have a Microsoft E5 license and they're helping you, set up your IAM, well, you might have someone in your environment, you probably do, I would guarantee, who is logging in as an admin to that Azure instance from a laptop somewhere, right? From some kind of endpoint, right? They're doing that using a credential, right? That's something that's going to be highly targeted by attackers, because guess what? If the attackers get into that environment, even if you're doing proper cloud IAM, which that's a whole separate conversation, because a lot of the research shows there's a lot of over provisioning there, right? And a lot of misunderstanding of how that's done. And but for those instances, especially if they're hybridized, this product suite will help you analyze, understand, and protect those credentials.
Fantastic, Tyler. One more question. I know the identity piece. We saw in one of the initial slides that there was 3 pillars: the endpoint, the cloud, and identity. And then we saw overlay, which was the singularity platform. So just to confirm, this piece of the puzzle is integrated into the Singularity Council and is not a standalone product?
Yeah, so this is integrated in, so you can buy this and all the data will flow into your SentinelOne XDR. Now, this can be purchased as a standalone product currently, right? So again, identity infrastructure is something that a lot of EDRs and EPPs struggle with, right? That early stage reconnaissance stuff. That's why SentinelOne actually ultimately acquired TiVo Networks, who built out the identity suite that has now become Singularity Identity for SentinelOne. So if you are already using a different EPP or EDR and you're not at the point where you can contemplate moving to complete new platform, but this is still a concern for you, which it really should be, we can absolutely go and just install the identity protection alongside whatever else is in play, so that you can get this coverage for the identity infrastructure. But if you are a SentinelOne customer, this is a module that we just add on, right? It's a new thing in your little dashboard that appears, and you just have to go and configure it and set it up, and then you will have that data in your SentinelOne console as well.
Tyler, thank you very much. We appreciate you driving through the identity piece with us today. It's all about risk reduction, and you did a great job understanding how to get from where you are to where you need to be. So once again, thank you again, and look forward to continuing the conversation another day.
Absolutely, Ernesto. I appreciate you having me on, and hopefully this was helpful and informative.
All right. Have a good one.
You too.